Hello, this is Myriad Thoughts. This is Jason.
And this is Grace.
And today we're going to talk to you about experience.
Yes. It's what we all want. XP. Give me my XP GM.
Yes. We all want to get our little XP, get our characters to be more powerful, learn new things. Or do we? There's the question of why do we give experience?
Mm-hmm.
Before we touch on, how you get it, or how much, or all of that, why do we give experience to characters? It's perfectly reasonable that we could have characters who never advance.
Right, certainly, especially if you're doing a one-shot or a short game, it's not necessarily needed, or, if you've pre-generated characters or some sort.
Right. If the characters are never going to actually have a chance to use that experience, then there's not any point in giving experience or XP.
Right, or even if you're doing a long game as far as the number of sessions played, but the game itself is taking place over the course of like a week, and it's like a very high drama thing. Are the characters really going to have a chance to change? If, do you actually, are the players supposed to be choosing what they're spending it on, or is it something that the GM might say, okay, you've established a connection with this, so you get a little note to your character, but you don't actually give XP.
Right. Now, I think in a longer game, there is a much more of a need for experience. I think that people like to have something that they're striving towards. Mm-hmm. They like to see their characters improve and accomplish things.
Yeah, and I think it's important that, the XP itself is given by the GM as far as the number or quality of XP, but ultimately becomes the player's choice of how does my character advance. And, beyond, possibly not being able to buy skills that they have had no experience with, or the GM's disallowing or something, it is a sort of a personal thing for the growth of, of the character that it be pushed and followed up with by the player.
I can see that. I think really, experience is just, to me it seems like the sort of guaranteed advancement a character can have. Because you can have all sorts of advancement for a character. He might, make a big pile of money on the latest adventure, or make allies in high places in the course of the game. But you might also, you might lose money. You might, you might make enemies. You may discover your allies are really plotting against you. But experience is there for things that to guarantee that your character is progressing forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think it's also important. Like, I know in the World of Darkness settings, part of the recommended XP award ceremony at the end of each session is to talk to each of the each of the players and ask, what did you learn? What did your character learn? And therefore it actually, and then that becomes reflected in the how they spend their XP, to build their character. It's something that you can't take away from their character, because they have advanced to that level.
Right. And the other reasons for including XP include things like, logically over a long time period, your character is going to learn new skills.
Mm-hmm. And I think in some systems, the experience is very neatly tied to the power level of that character, and so it helps with the balancing of sessions and things,
Mm-hmm. Or more as a gauge for what challenges to throw at a character.
Well, I know that D&D especially was built on that, which there can be problems with recommended power level for parties and such, but it does start to set a gauge at a level. The skills that your players choose to develop can help the GM know what direction the player wants the game to go in. If they're buying up social skills and things like that, and that's at least one indicator that they really want to do a more social game. If they're buying up their combat skills, that's one indicator that they want to do. They want to have a chance to be more awesome in combat. Now, obviously, that's combined with talking to your players and seeing how they'd react to what you're giving them.
It's another source of feedback about the game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So then, of course, you start to think about, well, how much experience is appropriate for what you're going, for what's happening.
And to my mind, there are several different aspects of that. The first of which is how fast you want the game to progress. Because the more experience you give the players, the more powerful they'll become. And so that sort of sets the tempo, how fast the game escalates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So if you're planning sort of a mid-length campaign, it's not going to run for more than a whole year or anything like that, then you don't want to be like really stingy with the XP, because then if a player's going for sort of a more expensive thing that they really want to get, if they only get it and at the very end and they haven't really made any achievements, that player might get frustrated, before the end of the session.
Right. That feeds into a bit of expectations of how far things will get.
Mm-hmm.
If you were going to do, let's say we have a 12-session game, just so we have sort of a basis there.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that the story is never going to, isn't going to escalate tremendously. Like maybe you're all cops in a police department, and at the end there's like going to be a big showdown with some corrupt politician or something. Then we know we're not going to be having to deal with international terrorists. We're not going to get to the point of John McClane and Die Hard. So the characters don't have to become substantially more powerful
mm-hmm.
to satisfy that climax.
Right.
And so in that case, you might not give out as much experience as opposed to another game where maybe you have the same 12 sessions to play, but the characters are going to ultimately find out, there are the drug dealers are secretly controlled by vampires, and they need to go take down this vampire lord at the end.
Right, and if you're humans going up against vampires, they're going to need some serious XP in their back pocket.
Right, exactly. In that case, you would expect there to be a lot more experience who can actually complete the story.
And of course, some of that comes from, you have to figure out, well, how much could they realistically learn? And, you got to realize that just because you're only having 12 game sessions, you can certainly have downtime within the game where they, not only are they buying up to rank 4, say, in Brawl or something, but they also had the extra time to really get that.
Right, and that gets into the point of realism.
Mm-hmm.
How realistic is it for the characters to advance to that level?
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, if there's a lot of downtime, then realism isn't too big of a deal.
Mm-hmm.
You could, if you have like 5 years of game time, maybe you only have a given adventure only happens once a year or something like that. You could still see a character becoming like a world-class sniper or something in that period, if that's what he's devoting his time to, and his experience, obviously.
And, I think some of this comes from making sure that it is realistic as a player. I think it's partly you should have an idea of where you want your character to go, and you should share some of that with the GM, because if you really do want to, go and train in the mountains of Tibet for like 3 months so that you're ready to face the vampire lord, or then make sure that you've talked that over with the GM. If that doesn't fit with their notion of realism, or you're not, perhaps you'll find out that that's actually not the expectation for this game.
Right. I typically, in terms of the realism dynamic, I tend to see the PCs as sort of they're the exceptions. They're the people who they're the people who are the prodigies, who excel. Because I have a lot of NPCs, and most of them will not really improve substantially over the course of a game. Mm-hmm. Maybe they'll gain a level, or they'll raise a stat here or there. But in general, most NPCs are sort of static in terms of their capabilities.
Right. It's because the PCs are the characters that stuff's happening to. So
Right, they're the main characters.
you know,
And other than a few crucial NPCs who might also advance, maybe their favorite allies, or maybe they're the rivals or villains. If they're not in those categories, then they sort of stay on their background characters, and they shouldn't be stealing the spotlight in any way,
right,
which typically means they're not advancing.
right. Yeah, how much? And of course, I mean, any GM book is going to give you some guidelines for
Right.
rewarding XP, but once you get past that first game that you've run on that system, really reflect on how the XP worked and how it might work for the game length that you're going to be running.
I mean, and one thing to keep in mind is you don't always have to give the same amount throughout the course of the game, at least in terms of advancement. For example, in D&D, I often give a lot of experience early on, because first and second level isn't particularly survivable. And then as the game progresses, I'll sort of dial it back a little bit in terms of how much XP I'm giving out.
And I think I've sort of noticed in the mage game that you've been running for such a long time, towards the end here, we've been getting more experience than we might have before. But we're
because
coming up to the end.
Right, because I'm building up to a very big climax.
Yeah, much bigger than a little vampire lord, so,
Right, and I want the characters to... Because I don't expect that any of my players are going to reach the same levels of power in another game, or at least it's unlikely.
Right.
I want to let them have the full range of experience. And I'm quite willing to throw very powerful things at them in the last few adventures. And so, whatever they get, they get.
Yeah. So how do you determine, like, what do you reward experience for, say, in a White Wolf game?
In a White Wolf game, well, there's a few guidelines. There's the sort of, standard 1 XP for showing up, 1 XP for role-playing, 1 XP for learning something new. And I typically give maybe 1 or 2 more points, depending on the particulars of the story. If I feel like it was a really great session, people learned a lot, or there was a lot of great role-playing going on, I'll probably give, 4 XP. If it was the end of a particular story, like an adventure got concluded, then I might go as high as 6 experience.
Now, White Wolf's a little different from some of the other systems that I've played in that it has 2 different pools of experience.
Well, some aspects of White Wolf have 2 different pools of experience.
Yeah, well.
So for example, there's Mage the Awakening, which you've been playing in for a long while. That has arcane experience, which sort of reflects mysteries that the characters have resolved, interesting arcane aspects of the world that they've learned. And so this sort of pushes the group to learn more and more about the world, constantly be digging into mysteries and learning about supernatural events, because that gives them more arcane experience, which they can then use to increase their power, learn new magics, and become more powerful mages. And you were also in my Promethean game, which we had Vitrol, which is another sort of a similar extra batch of experience, which comes from Prometheans. You're playing sort of a resurrected Frankenstein monster trying to become human. And so Vitrol represents experience gained by accomplishing certain milestones on their goal to becoming human.
Well, but I enjoy the idea of the split XP pool, because the arcane experience in Mage or the Vitrol in Promethean, that is a restricted pool which can only be spent it's really on your more your spectacular powers, basically, versus spent on attributes and skills and background type.
Right. It sort of helps you buy those really expensive powers and pushes you to buy more of them. But also, what I like about them is they're awarded for things that push your character to engage in that aspect of the game more.
Well, and I would think, since we're sort of doing this this talk on the point of view of how much you could technically choose to skew the amount of XP that you're giving into arcane and versus regular XP, for example. If you really wanted your characters to be playing more with that magic, say, especially, maybe if it was your first or second time doing a mage game, and you want to see some of the cooler, some of the different higher level mage powers come out, by giving people more arcane, that encourages that to be happening. Perhaps a little bit more arcane than you. I'm not saying give them 20 every day, but a little bit more than you might otherwise do.
I think 10's the most I've ever given.
Right, and that's a pretty high chunk.
Yes, there were some caveats to that one. In Mage, there's a thing called the Astral, and Astral games are all about uncovering the puzzles of the world and learning more about the universe. And so all experience for an Astral game session is arcane XP. And in that particular one, they uncovered some really impressive stuff.
Yeah, of course, there are some systems like the Apocalypse World that I've been playing recently that actually deal with the experience mechanic by having. It's basically more of a player choice based off what skills you're using in a particular session that get highlighted.
Right. So in Apocalypse World, both the GM and your fellow players can sort of steer your character towards different
acting more violent or more manipulative or more searching, and based on then choosing to use that set of skills for that game session advances your character faster, which is an interesting thing. And of course, the GM at that point, the GM doesn't really control too much any kind of rewarding XP at the end. However, they can say, well, actually, you don't need to make that roll. In case somebody's wanting to try to be, maybe
to push the button too hard.
Yeah, munch it a little bit too much. And on the other hand, too, you can also, as a GM, award, just like sometimes happens in White Wolf, award a contact or background thing based off the character's actions. You now have a connection with ghosts, or you now have a new movement that you can do because you were betrayed by that person,
Right. Now, the idea of using experience to guide player actions, I think, is a very important one. Because there are some systems where I feel like that sometimes gets in the way of the story, particularly in D&D.
Yeah, I mean...
Where it's all, you kill monsters and you get experience.
You kill them and you take their stuff. And, I mean, if you want to advance and get better at killing things, then you've got to kill things. Because that's how you get experience.
Yeah.
And disarming traps, perhaps. Really, killing monsters is where it's at. And then, if you want to actually have stuff, and therefore be, magically protected from all the nasty stuff that you have to go up and kill to get advanced higher levels, well, then you've got to take their stuff.
Right. And so that leads to the classic kick in the door, kill the monsters, take their stuff thing, which can be somewhat problematic if you want to run a game that's more based on
political intrigue.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, you can get around it, but the game as it's built sort of pulls you in that direction.
Right.
So you're sort of bending the rules to get to where you want to be. Mm-hmm. Now, in old school D&D, which you've never played, but I have, you would actually get experience for treasure. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't even so much killing the monsters. You just
based
rob
off
them.
the monetary value.
Yeah, that was a long time ago. So let's talk about other ways that you can get experience. Mm-hmm. I mentioned a little bit about getting experience for participating in a game. Mm-hmm. Showing up, role playing, and that sort of thing. I don't know how I feel about giving extra experience for role-playing. I do it occasionally, but I always feel a little iffy about it.
I don't know. I think it's wholly fair if it is truly good role-playing. I think. Yeah. I mean, I think that some of it, if if you got somebody who's actually like crying tears, because they're feeling what their character's feeling, and then someone passes them a bag of chips and they snap out of it, and you're like, wow, that was role playing. That was it, Then and they actually keep it up and it's consistent. Then I think that it's totally worth, at least a little bit more experience. The same if you can see that by that good role playing, that good acting, the rest of the players are drawn into it.
Yeah.
More into the game, then that definitely deserves a reward because that's what you want. You want your players to be as engaged as possible, as reacting as truly as they can. And the more that you have the other players believing in that world and believing in themselves and their characters, I think it makes it an easier and more fun for the GM.
Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah, my main concern with it though is not having one character gain a lot more experience than the other characters.
Of course, you can also do something that we mentioned on another podcast with the hero point reward instead,
right,
where you give the power to the group to vote on somebody, and they get a hero point, which is not experience, but is something to be used. Now, you could possibly put it up to the group to say, vote on the best role playing, but
that's true.
I mean, I think to some extent it depends on, what system are you running, and what are your goals for the game, but I think considering some sort of possibility for excellent role play is a good idea.
Yeah. Outside of the game session, because I have a website for my games, so I let people add things to the website, their little notes on what their character's been doing, how they feel about things.
Or photo manipulations, or sometimes actually even maintaining a journal for the game.
Right. And I think that works pretty well. It definitely encourages them to continue to contribute, which is nice, because I've had players make some really nice, images and writings and stuff. And particularly from my Amber game that I ran, I had a lot of nice contributions that were added to the website. So I encourage that sort of behavior. I try to keep the awards for that low, but still sufficient to encourage them to keep contributing.
Right, because I think, there are going to be some people who simply don't have the time to do it,
right.
And even if it was worth a whole bunch, they still couldn't quite, swing it. And, I mean, you can be creative with what you'll allow, but some people just, they're not artistic. Maybe their computer's not working very well. They can't use Photoshop. They don't want to write something because it takes them a longer time than other, they just don't have it for whatever reason, and you don't want to penalize them. You don't want to have everybody being suddenly, say 3 levels ahead of them by the end of the game.
Now there are some other experience systems that are very different from. I mean, there are several different experience systems. You have D&D where you have a level based progression where you reach a number of experience and then pop, you've got all these extra abilities and so forth.
Right.
And then you have the more point-based systems like White Wolf or GURPS, where you gain experience and then you can spend so many points to get this or that ability.
Right.
But there's also systems. I know there's one that you've always been sort of intrigued with, where you use a skill, and your success or failure on that skill then allows you to advance that skill. So I think you talked about
Rune Quest. Yeah, although it's been a while since I've read that, so I didn't review how they deal with experience, if they do at all. So I can't really speak to that.
I know that One Ring, which is the most recent...
Had a lot of fun playing that game.
Yes. The most recent Lord of the Rings game has something like that, where if you get an exceptional success, then you can mark that skill and potentially advance it.
I also really liked that system for their mechanics for traveling in, say, a fantasy-based type world. So I would also recommend it. Check that out if you're interested in that as well. I do like also there are games, more some of the newer generation of games that it's not the basic experience or level progression, but in some ways it ties players together. How you advance or the success of your character is structurally tied to other people in the game. So the One Ring game you have to identify a favored person in the party that, and if they die, it's going to really hurt your character. So, which is, of course, very true to the Fellowship type story.
The Apocalypse
and in
world.
Apocalypse world, yes.
Yeah, you have a history mechanic, and as you learn more about your fellow characters, that too can actually give you experience.
Yeah, because and that's the player feels that they have learned more about, or that they have learned more about somebody. They can say, I'll give it to you, and you bump up your experience with them, and then at the point, yeah. So it's very and of course the modifier for history also affects what happens in game too.
Right.
So yeah, I'm sure there's other systems out there. If you know of one, you can comment and let us know.
Right. Other things you can get experience for are, of course, completing a story. Getting a significant achievement in the game. So I use this a lot in my White Wolf games, because I structure my adventures as stories.
Mm-hmm.
So after a story is completed, the monster is slain or the mystery is solved, the group will typically get 1 or 2 extra experience on top of that. Potentially a lot more, depending on how difficult the story was.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think the thing to do is really think about what's your system and what do you want your characters to be doing within the system. Particularly if you're trying to run a D&D game that you want to be skewing more towards, political intrigue, say.
Right.
Then think about making sure that your players know that they're going to be able to get experience for, say, solving the puzzle of, getting this merchant to do what they want without hurting them, or something like that. I mean, you are the GM, so you can change the XP rules. Just make sure that it's clear from the start.
Yeah, one thing that I played around with in my last D&D game was to try and I don't think I made it as clear as I could have, but I wanted to give experience for accomplishing quests.
Mm-hmm.
So if you snuck through the ogre's lair and retrieved the magic ring, or if you killed him and got the magic ring, those should be equivalent in terms of experience.
Yeah, that kind of mirrors World of Warcraft type games where, that's because of how the game is coded, getting either physically getting the thing, or in a lot of cases having to go back to the little quest giver with a little exclamation mark. That's how you get your experience to advance. And so you can use that idea, and
I think that would be really useful for more of a stealth based game.
Definitely. If you don't want someone rushing in there and just killing everything and taking its stuff, but let them know that they're out of game. There's out of game rewards, not just the in-game power connections and possible money payment, but that they're actually going to get experience, not only for any traps avoided and things like that, but for getting in there and out without killing somebody. They'll get the equivalent of, I don't know, a troll. I don't know.
Yeah, something. All right. So when to give experience? Now, I know in most games, you typically get your experience at the end of a session.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of the typical end of the game thing. It's like, oh, we're done. How much experience do we get? But there are some systems and some games where you might give experience in the middle of a session. Hunter the Vigil, for instance, has that, where if you encounter a monster mid-session, you can get practical XP from dealing with it,
mm-hmm.
which can be handy if you need to learn a particular tactic or skill before the final bit of the game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, incidentally, any of you who have played White Wolf and haven't checked out Hunter, it has a sort of interesting mechanic system with the practical experience that allows for the purchase of group tactics, which of course is very useful if you're human hunters going up against, supernatural creatures, but might also be, I think, really interesting if you wanted to apply it to, say, a Middle Ages type setting, where you actually might have some more troop combat, or possibly even if you're doing a White Wolf game, say, based in a, police system or something like that.
Right.
Just a little aside.
Yeah. The other thing with mid-session XP giving out is you can do something like a sort of a training montage to cover, the characters gaining their skills. It's a common trope in movies, and it's perfectly reasonable to do in role-playing games.
Right. Other games with mid-session things are like Apocalypse World. Mention that. I mean,
right. You can gain an experience, which basically means you can gain a new move or a boost to your stat in the middle of a session.
In fact, it's common to possibly have one or two of those happen.
Yeah.
And expect them to happen.
And so there's that possibility of your character advancing in the middle of a game. Let's see, as far as other options for when to give experience, we've already sort of covered never, where characters just don't advance. Another possibility is to only give experience at the end of a quest. I've seen this done in D&D quite often, where the characters might be in the bottom of a dungeon, and we might not, they might not get their experience until the next session when they've actually left the dungeon.
Well, it makes sense if you've built your dungeon and calibrated it based off of the party's abilities, and you know that somebody's suddenly going to get what's the, an evasion thing that's going to totally make the end monster be a breeze for them, But of course, I think the biggest thing is what you establish you should stick with for the length of a campaign. I mean, the idea of end of quest would tie in with sort of that way to modify D&D that we talked about.
Right. Well, I think the way that I've always seen the end of quest experience dealt with is the idea that the characters need training outside of their dungeoning. Because, like I said, this goes back to the old D&D where you actually had to go and train up after you've gained enough experience to gain that extra level.
So that downtime is required. There's a time requirement as well as a experience requirement.
Right. You can't just suddenly develop these new abilities. You need to have downtime to learn them. And
to some extent, that depends on how much experience you're giving out and what you want for your how much you want your characters to be advancing. And of course, I think as the GM, it's perfectly reasonable for you to disallow somebody to buy something, but you've got to make it reasonable. So, for example, in White Wolf, buying one level of something, one level more for a skill than they had, that's, as long as they had the skill, that's not too big. But if maybe they saved a lot of experience, they were thinking maybe to buy something really, big, and then they decide, I want to buy, actually I'm going to buy up 3 levels of, of melee fighting and
I might say no to that.
Yeah, well, you might say no, or you might, but actually probably the best response would be you need to actually have some story-based downtime that explains how you got that skill.
Right. I mean, if we had a break of several months, then I might accept that. Certainly, if they were only buying up 2 levels of weaponry.
Well, or if the player creates with you a another person that they're training with, or that's still a huge power jump, but it's also something that you might consider.
Yeah, I rarely see people buy up lots of skill all at once.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't. If you have the experience for it, why not just buy it if you wanted it?
Yeah, most people will buy it up incrementally.
Yeah, I think it probably happens more often if there is already an announced downtime, or if, like I said, say they were saving up for say in Mage a level of Gnosis, and they decide that that they don't want that level. After all, they have like 30 XP sitting around, and they instead want to go to a totally different direction. That still needs to be explained on a story level.
Right. Right. And I think the important thing is to work with your players to help them get that explanation through.
Of course, there's also the idea that you might, with D&D, because it is a flat level system, you might hold off until the end of a quest. But you could also put limitations or restrictions or qualifications on when somebody spends.
Mm-hmm.
So, you could decide that any sort of, like, any mental or physical skill, say in White Wolf, that there has to be a time requirement to it, and therefore they might have a lot of stuff sitting around, but they
right. In fact, Mike from our other podcast has done this in his Mage games, where he actually was putting a time requirement on how long it takes to gain next level of a Arcanum dot, which in Mage, Arcana dictates how powerful magics you can cast. Because he wanted to keep his players from advancing to the most extreme levels, and try and keep enough downtime between that.
So, for example, if you are running a mid-length campaign and you want, say in a Mage game, and you want to see the different powers, but you don't want them to be too advanced, you could give them lots of Arcana, but lots of arcane experience, but have a requirement for time for spending. That, of course, that would generally push or make it pretty clear that you expect your players to differentiate a lot, to have different Arcanas that they're investing in.
Right. Another thing you can do, separate from a time requirement, is to just put an additional non-experience requirement on a particular level. Like perhaps you're fine with them, being fairly powerful mages, but that you don't want them to be mastering an Arcana outright. So you might say, oh, in order to get the mastery, you need to go on this quest or something like that.
Yeah.
Which is what I did in my Mage game, where in order to reach mastery, you had to go on a astral journey to learn the secrets of magic.
Yeah. So I think, experience in a lot of ways, as long as you are doing a game where you want there to be change and adaptability in your players, experience is really like the gas for players. And as the GM, you can decide how much you give them. You just got to realize, we all saw in Hurricane Sandy what happened when the gas scarcity thing went out. People were not happy. And so, you can't starve players of experience if that's what they're if they're expecting to have experience.
And on the converse, you should also expect if you give them a lot of gas, players will put the pedal to the metal.
Exactly. And you have to think because I think there's some games that could be kind of fun, if you're dealing with, say, like a superhero type game, and you're already trying to, the trope of that is how do you deal with these amazing powers when you're an ordinary person? Does it corrupt you, or does it make you a better man or woman? So if you give them a lot of experience, then it kind of, it's going to add a lot of chaos to the game, but that might be part of what you're playing with.
That's true.
So, don't be locked into what the game books say, but of course also realize, read that section carefully before you start out your next campaign, because, it has been play tested. There's some ideas, behind why they're suggesting that, but there's certainly things that you can play with to really craft the game the way that you want it and make your expectations clear to your players.
Yes. I think that brings us to the end of our talk on experience. Any of you have ideas or viewpoints that you want to share? Please, leave us your comments. And if we see anything there that we feel needs to be addressed further, we may do another talk on experience.
Yeah, definitely. If you guys have any questions for us, we'd be happy to address those in a future podcast. And I hope that you enjoyed listening to Myriad Plots with Grace and Jason.
Yep. Bye.
Thank you for listening to our show. Please visit our website at noordinaryobsession.com, where you'll find show notes from this and other podcasts, along with our blog and Twitter feed. This has been a production of No Ordinary Media, all material copyright unless otherwise noted. As always, be kind to us and subscribe to our feeds. Good night.